We now return to Motor City Burning, a special presentation of WILS News.
People moving out, people moving in. Why? Because of the color of their skin. Run, but you sure can't hide.
Back in Detroit, white flight and homicides went into overdrive. Between 1964 and 1966, an average of 22,000 whites had left the city each year. 47,000 departed in 1967, 80,000 in 1968, and another 46,000 in 1969. Back in 1960, the year that the mayor and police commissioner had instituted a state of emergency in Detroit, the city had 150 homicides. By 1972, that number had exploded to 601. In the meantime, Hubert Locke, the pastor who had spent his entire life in Detroit, decided to pick up his family and leave for good.
There were several reasons. I had, before going to work for the police department, been the executive director of an urban coalition effort that Walter Reuther had created in 1962 or 3 called the Citizens Committee for Equal Opportunity. And that had involved all of the white business and industrial elite in town. The committee had the heads of the 3 automotive firms on it and the leading mercantilists in town. After the riot occurred, some of the business contingent, Henry Ford II, I remember being prominently one of them, let it be known that clearly they had been dealing with the wrong black people in town, the wrong black leadership, because obviously the leadership they had been in conversation and discussion and working with to try to develop all sorts of programs hadn't been able to keep the natives from being restless. So that was my first huge disappointment. The white leadership decided that they were going to have to deal with a different segment of the black community, and that said to a number of us, well, there's obviously no place for me left in the city any longer. And then I remember just all sorts of other indignities. The insurance companies quit writing homeowners insurance in a huge section of the swath of Detroit, including my neighborhood on Boston and 14th. So I couldn't get homeowners protection, homeowners insurance in the city. My area was redlined for all practical purposes. And I just slowly and painfully came to the conclusion that Detroit was not the place for me to be any longer.
Crime is increasing. Trigger happy. Police.
Former Wayne County Sheriff Roman Gribbs succeeded Jerome Cavanaugh as mayor in 1970. Gribbs' police commissioner, John Nichols, instituted an anti-crime unit called STRESS, which stood for Stop Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. The unit began operation in January 1971. Officer X explains how the unit worked.
It was very successful because they shot everybody. Police would put a decoy out posing as he was drunk, stumbling down the street, and he was just an easy target. The person who later got shot, I don't think he left his house saying, I'm going to commit a robbery. He was an opportunist. There's an easy mark. He walks up, he asks for a quarter. The guy says, get the hell away from me. I got no quarter for you. And then he ends up pushing him up against the wall, reaching in his pockets, takes his wallet out, and as he's walking away, he got shot. And that's the way STRESS worked. They made a murder squad out of this guy, this unit. They just shot everybody. And they were rewarded for it. But the concept was good. But you need to arrest these people, not shoot them dead.
3 years after STRESS was put into operation, 22 citizens, most of them black, had been shot dead by STRESS officers. The city's 1973 mayoral race pitted Police Commissioner Nichols against State Senator Coleman Young. Young won the race by 14,000 votes and ushered in a series of police reforms. He abolished the STRESS unit, And for the first time in Detroit history, the city government put integration of its police force as a top priority. However, just as Detroit's black population had elected the city's first black mayor, the backbone of Michigan's economy, the auto industry, took a turn for the worse and has remained in a bout of fits and starts ever since. During the 1970s, GOP Governor William Milliken worked closely with the wily Democrat Coleman Young to try and bring Detroit back from the ashes of 1967. In an interview that became part of WKAR's off-the-record television special entitled The Millikens, the longest-serving governor in state history told of his relationship with Young and his belief that as Detroit goes, so goes the rest of the state.
I had a very close working relationship, as you know, with Mayor Coleman Young. We started off on not a very safe ground and congenial ground, but I genuinely felt at the time that what happened in Detroit had a major bearing on what was happening in Michigan, and that if Detroit were to go down, then Michigan would be also in line to go down. The two were inextricably tied together. And gradually, I think he began to realize that I was genuine about my conviction and my concern. And I gradually recognized that this man had a genuine commitment to his city, that he had qualities of intelligence and commitment that I highly respected, and we, as time went on, began to work closely together, trust each other, work together, and I think it ended up in the interests of Michigan and of Detroit that we did. There is still a tendency in certain quarters to use Detroit as a whipping boy. This age-old battle between Detroit and outstate Michigan, just like Chicago and downstate Illinois, or New York City and upstate New York, it's an age-old battle that goes on, and we ought to stop it.
In addition, a noble attempt in the early 1970s by state and local officials to institute a public school busing desegregation program among 53 school districts in Metro Detroit was met with tremendous opposition. A legal challenge to the plan resulted in a landmark 1974 Supreme Court case, Milliken v. Bradley. The High Court, in a 5-4 decision, found that because there was no evidence showing a systematic program of Jim Crow segregation amongst Detroit's suburban districts, they cannot be forced to bus their students into Detroit or receive Detroit students into their districts. Over 3 decades later, Governor Milliken still feels that the plan was needed.
I certainly agreed with it, that the schools were segregated and separate schools were hardly equal.
Roger Wilkins agrees with Milliken, but adds also that Detroit's auto industry ego has doomed the city.
A long time ago, I was writing a piece about Detroit in my journalism days, and I interviewed Doug Frazier, who was then the president of the UAW. And I said, what in the hell happened? I said, everybody who could see understood by the 60s that there was a need for a real market for little cars. Why in the hell didn't the car companies do it? He said, well, Ruther and the UAW had the idea. They understood. And Ruther made that proposal. And I said, and what happened? I said, the guys who ran the car company said, Mr. Ruther, you run your union and we'll run the auto companies.
Former Mayor Dennis Archer felt that the Milliken versus Bradley decision hurt race relations and public education.
People felt that if you were going to have full and complete and positive integration as it relates to the school system, you needed to have cross-district busing. Because if you looked at the city of Detroit, Mayor Coleman Young, when he was elected in 1973, the majority of the city of Detroit was still white. Today, it's about 90% people of color. If cross-district busing had been allowed, I think it would have helped a great deal to improve the racial climate and to enhance public education for all of our children. But when that was denied and when that was prevented, it really hurt that initiative, and it did hurt, I think, at the end, public education.
Presumably, this means that if and when the Detroit School District becomes 95% or more black, immediately surrounded by suburban school districts, 95% or more white, no problem of federal constitutional significance arises. It can come to represent a formula for American apartheid. I know of no decision made by the Supreme Court since the Dred Scott decision, which is so fraught with disaster for the country. Justice George Edwards, 1975.
Motor City Burning, a special presentation of WILS News, will continue in a moment.